Hello to the ones who have connected to us. I am Nelly from Achievers Hub. As you may know, we are a meeting point for indie developers, publishers, investors, and their mentors who help them find useful connections and make much more profit of their games and help them be noticed by the public and various cool publishers and companies. So today we are having a webinar with Falco Böker from JoyPac, and the topic of the webinar is hyperspeed for hypercasual and how rapid testing is changing the game. So Falco, you can start.
All right, perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Also, thank you very much for having me here. I'll switch right over to the presentation. So let me share my screen here. All right, I hope everybody can see that all right. Yeah, as you mentioned, the topic is hyperspeed for hypercasual. We are rapidly testing a lot of games in hypercasual right now. It is not something that is exclusive to hypercasual, especially on mobile. You see it often in other kind of genres as well, casual games, mid-core games. Testing is an important part, but there's something that makes it very unique for hyper-casual and also changed a lot during the last couple of months to a year. And I think that's very interesting to look at how things have changed lately. Let me start with a couple quick words about myself. So I'm Falco. I'm in the games industry for about 13 years now, always dealing with free-to-play games in some sense. I started out very briefly as an editor for some online magazines, but then I moved to Gamigo, which was a PC MMO publisher, so a lot of Asian developed PC MMOs, some browser games as well, though. Where I learned everything about kind of like monetizing these kind of games and how that kind of market works, which later transferred very well to kind of other platforms as well. I also spent some time at Remote Control Productions, which is the other side. It's a family of development studios in Germany and Austria back at the time. Now they expanded into even more countries. And it was very interesting for me to kind of see the whole process from the developer side as well, to learn a little bit how all these kind of things that I was used to from a publisher perspective look from the other side. But then I was way more comfortable on the publishing side. So I went back first to Flare Games, which is like my complete shift to mobile. So that's where I did exclusively mobile from that point on. In 2017, Flare Games was mostly responsible for like bigger mid-core kind of multi-year productions. So very differently when I joined JoyPac now, shifting gears into hyper-casual where things are just moving so much faster in development and publishing, and also of course in testing, which what I'm going to talk about today. At JoyPac, I'm what we call a senior publishing manager. I'm kind of the interface between us as a publisher and the developer. So from the first contact, on conferences when they're happening, and via email, wherever, I'm kind of like on the front lines explaining our company to the developers and then taking them through the whole journey of negotiating deals, being in daily contact when it comes to questions about publishing their games, and kind of trying to interface between the teams on both sides. I'm a massive gamer myself. Although I play a lot of mobile games, my favorite game of all time is a console game. Just as a fun fact, Shadow of the Colossus for me, perfect mix of art and mechanics of game design. So yeah, I can highly recommend people checking that out. Today, as I said, I want to talk a little bit about testing, and I roughly grouped that into 4 different categories. So I want to start out with like talking about why we test, like what is the reasoning, what are we trying to get to, what are kind of like the goals that we have in testing for hyper-casual games specifically. And when I say testing, I mean specifically market testing with real users, not kind of like small internal tests or purely technical tests. So like, yeah, market tests. And then I kind of want to transfer into what does that mean to the developer-publisher relationship, right? That changed a lot because before the testing was later in the development process, and now with this new setup and these new faster tests, it also changed the deal structure that people can react. So a little bit for the developer, I want to explain what they can kind of expect when going into a partnership with a hyper-casual games publisher these days. Then the third part is how we test. So kind of the structure, the more workmanship style of what channels are being used, what KPIs are specifically targeted, what are some good practices to follow, and so on. And then at the very end, but definitely last but not least, the KPIs. So like, how do we spot a game that performs well? And specifically, what are numbers that are considered good in the industry by publishers? Which of these numbers kind of give you a hint that, hey, you might have a success on your hand there? So one of the things is, like, these days we're getting very quickly to the top of the funnel of how a player moves through your game, right? So in the first contact that your player is going to have with your game is usually some kind of marketing that they're seeing. That's pretty general for mobile games overall, where you don't have things that you have on the PC console side, like very strong brand loyalty, where you have people that buy every game from a specific developer anyway and kind of champion for it online. There's not this kind of hype that builds up big shows where people line up just to see trailers. And it's also not covered in the media the same way, right? So you don't have these tons of websites. You have a couple on really good ones, but you don't have the amount of websites and eyes on those websites of people trying to find out more information about the upcoming mobile games. So marketing is kind of one of the main way to bring your games into the front of people's eyes. And UA, just to explain for people that might not know, it's a user acquisition, so paid marketing to specifically get users online. It's also, for hyper-casual, a little bit more problematic than other mobile games, because there's very limited incentive for the stores to push these games. Maybe a little bit more for Google than for Apple, because Google is a bit more involved in the advertisement game. But Apple kind of is more interested in games that offer higher in-app purchases, where they make a bigger share on those games, which they don't necessarily do with hyper-casual games. So, which is one reason why we see hyper-casual games being even more reliant on direct marketing that other mobile games are. Another factor is the low lifetime of hyper-casual games. So you'll lose a large amount of your users within a very short time frame, which means you have less time to monetize them and make the money back you spend on marketing. And they're likely to not spend money in your game at all. So in-app purchases are very rare in most kind of sectors of hyper-casual. And so you're relying a lot of ad monetization, but then you have limited time. So it kind of limits how much money you can make back on a player. So it's really important that you optimize the CPI, the cost per install, to be as low as possible. And generally, we have very low margins. So for mid-core games, you see higher risk marketing because it costs you multiple dollars to get a single player into your game. But if you're really lucky and your game is really good, you're going to see huge margins of how much money they actually end up spending in the game, while this is much narrower in hyper-casual. So it's way cheaper to get people into the game, but then the amount of money that you can make is just limited by the style of game itself in a lot of cases. And there are a few examples that are a bit different, but I'm going to mention a few of them later on. And that's why the UA focus, like optimizing UA, usually yields you better results. There's kind of limited things that you can do in a hyper-casual game to raise that LTV. There are a few that I'm also going to talk about, but those are like also later in production, so it's harder to kind of like test these first. So we overall see a bigger shift and more focus on the top of that funnel, because people will not get to your core loop. They will not get to the meta game and really stay involved in the game if you don't get them into the game. So that's why there's so much focus on it. Hyper casual is a super fast market right now. So because games have such a low half-time, so to speak, before they are not trendy anymore, you see trends that are always changing. New kinds of games are coming up, new kind of focuses in hyper casual. So we see games that are incredibly simple, going for even lower CPIs, or games that start implementing more features or functionalities you would see in more mid-core games, from 2D to 3D to the style, the visual style of the game. Everything changes every couple of months or even weeks. So you have to be like really fast and reacting to things within the market. So since the games are also limited in scope, though, you can be very fast, and you have to be fast when it comes to from your idea to a prototype that you can test in a couple of days, definitely not more than a few weeks. And then often in a couple of months or even just a few weeks, you have a fully released games that then gets published and pushed by the publisher. You have to really be able to react to that pressure. You have to scale fast as well, because these games are kind of simple and there's a lot of interest in what's going on the market. Like most of the publishers and developers in hyper-casual are very sophisticated when it comes to looking at the market. They will also spot the trends really fast. So if you're testing something that is rising through the charts, but is obviously not ready, it will take somebody else a couple of weeks to kind of catch up to you and maybe even iterate on your idea and have a competing product. So if you have something that works well, you have to be able to execute on it really fast, finish the game up, push it, and launch a big marketing campaign for it. One of the reasons why we see things changing is the competition of the best kind of partnership that you can get in hyper-casual. So publishers, of course, want to work with the most talented studios, right? The ones that have cool new concepts every couple of days, can create multiple prototypes a month, and can develop really cool, high-quality games in a short period of time. On the same side, developers want to work with the publishers that give them the biggest and highest chance of success. So they're gravitating to the most valuable kind of partners in the market. But then also a lot of them have kind of like further ambitions beyond that. So a lot of hyper-casual studios actually want to become publishers themselves. You see, self-publishing is way more common in hyper-casual than it is in other genres. And a lot of developers can use their partnerships with publishers to kind of gain experience in like best publishing practices, learn a little bit more about the process. But on the same side, that means talent is getting taken out of the pool on a regular basis as well. So while a lot of them start out working with publishers, they kind of then stop that later on because they move more into self-publishing, or they just get acquired by a publisher. So the pool of the top teams that you can work with as a publisher is also constantly shrinking again. So you have to get new studios interested in working with you as well. And what a lot of publishers trying to do to kind of facilitate that is to establish longer ongoing partnerships. So you kind of want to exclusively work with a studio over multiple games. And we've seen that before, the kind of like trend of testing early in development, where developers that were usually pretty happy or had a hit with the publisher also kind of stuck around. But now we see more and more that the deals are set up in that way from the beginning to kind of facilitate that more, because it reduces overhead for both sides, right? So all the technical setup, understanding the SDKs that a publisher might require, knowing the people that you're working with, and kind of the process afterwards once the games are done and being tested. All of that is easier once you have established this once, and then you can just follow through on every new game that you have coming out, because they come out at such a frequency, and you don't have to renegotiate a deal for every single one. It's just way faster and more efficient to do it that way. For the developer, of course, that means that they know what the focus for their next game is going to be, right? They know they have a partner that is going to help out with that game, to actually give the game the time that you feel it deserves as a developer. While when you just like send a finished game out randomly to publishers, they might just like have a quick look and see if they think that could be successful or not, but without any more information, kind of like, yeah, go ahead or pass on it. But with this ongoing partnership, you know that you always will get some additional information and feedback out of it at the very least. So the risk of this whole thing is a little bit shifting recently. So a year ago, when we were working with developers, the overwhelming amount of games were finished games that were then handed to a publisher for testing. The risk was completely on the developer side when it came to the development of the games. Granted, hyper-casual games are smaller, so even on a smaller developer budget, you could make more nearly finished games to get tested to kind of find the successful one. But publishers were pretty free to kind of like pick and choose the top games. For smaller or even media publishers, that started to become a problem because, of course, as a developer, I want to work with the biggest possible partner I can have. So I would go to the biggest player in the market, show them my game. They probably run a test on it because in hyper casual, even back then, publishers were so willing to like do quick market tests on games that that you usually would get some kind of feedback, some kind of like somebody would look into your game a little bit more on that publisher side. So everything that performs exceptionally well would be picked off by those top publishers. Then if you don't get a deal with the top publisher, you move on to the next tier and so on. So if you were not already established as one of the biggest players, it was harder to get there as well, because usually you only got to see the games that were rejected by the couple top publishers in the market, and usually for very scientific reasons, actually the game being tested with users and not achieving the numbers it needs to be. So it was really hard to find quality content for smaller to mid-sized publishers. That is why they then started paying developers for the privilege of being the first to test these games. Usually that started early in production, kind of funding prototypes, funding limited versions of the game to kind of get dibs on being the first one to work with the game. Usually that didn't mean that all the rights get transferred to the publisher, but just puts them in front of the queue when it comes to deciding on these kind of games. And of course, that's something that the bigger publishers noticed as well, right? And they wanted to avoid the situation where they were kind of like relaxing on the studios that they were already working with, maybe some of their internal forces. But then, as I mentioned, some of them are also dropping out of the talent pool because they're kind of going into self-publishing or dissolving for some other reason. So bigger publishers also had to follow suit and started paying for these kind of privileges to kind of ensure that not all the cool and new upcoming content is then with another competitor, and kind of like you lose your grip on the market a little bit. It's still not as common for these, so it's not on the same scale as medium or smaller publishers are doing it. The big publishers really pick the couple of studios that they want to work with. It's not that they're just gonna like work with everyone on this basis. So and the way they work with these studios can still be different. So if you have like unique publisher experiences when it comes to publishers being specifically open or interactive with you, and you like that with previous tests already, usually that carries on towards these paid partnerships as well. Of course, like publishers are notoriously risk averse, so they wanted to keep that financial risk that they now started taking on as low as possible. And that's where we come to the big shift of testing faster, testing quicker, and kind of moving the whole part earlier into the production of the games. So publishers, what makes them special is a lot of their marketing and UA expertise over most developers. So they wanted to kind of play that card as fast as they could during the development of a game. So these days, almost all hyper-casual publishers have some kind of partnership structure where they're funding the studio of the game, the studio while making the games, testing early prototypes, or even earlier than that. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, to kind of quickly decide very early what are the really great or potentially great games, and what games don't really work as well as you, or which games don't really work as well as you think they would. And yeah, let me go on to the terms of how this usually works, because before it was pretty straightforward, right? The game's being made, the publisher tests it, they cover the cost for the marketing on their side for the test. After that, we generally saw kind of like 50-50 shares when it came to the profit or the revenues of the game. Now, of course, that changed a little bit. The publisher funding usually starts on day one of development. So they even discuss ideas with the developer. So they're involved into the process from day one on. They usually commit to multiple prototypes over multiple months. So something that we do internally, for example, is we commit to a 3-month period of 2 prototypes per month, which is enough to kind of like, it takes off the edge a little bit of having to renegotiate for every single one of these prototypes, something that can be easily extended, but it's also enough to kind of get a feeling for how this cooperation is working, right? Like on 1 or 2 prototypes, things can always go a bit south or weird because the timing is not great. But after doing this for 3 months, generally studios and publishers understand each other pretty well, and you kind of see if you want to take that partnership forward. That said, being paid for development is not the same as a traditional work for hire kind of situation where you would go out and hire a studio specifically to make a game to your specifications, because in those scenarios, you generally see that the developers charge some kind of markup on the development and are not really charged at cost basis. For this kind of funding, in some cases, the publisher doesn't even cover the full burn rate of the team, but kind of just as a signal takes on some of the risk during the development, but not necessarily kind of like hiring a developer to make a game for them. That's also why the ideas can kind of come from both sides. We know a couple of publishers that have very detailed ideas of the games that they want to see about the setting, the gameplay. But then there are also publishers that are way more open and kind of want to see what the developer comes up with their own ideas. We are trying more and more to be somewhere in between, where we try to identify through the advantages we have as a publisher to kind of have a lot of market insight, to get a lot of data and information through our connections, to kind of spot the things that might be interesting when it comes to themes, core settings, kind of trends that we think are potentially coming up, and then pitch those back and forth with the developer to have them use their creativity to come up with the best games that kind of fit that market intelligence that we can offer. The revenue shares are sometimes a little bit lower because of the risk that the publisher takes, not necessarily in all cases. But even lower in this case means you see something that is closer to maybe 30 to 40% of profit. So generally that is calculated as the revenue minus the money you pay to the store directly minus any direct cost of marketing you had. But 30 to 40% is still fairly high if you would compare it to something like a work for hire scenario. The reason why work for hire studios charge this markup on their development is they usually end up with under 10, sometimes around 5% of the revenue of it all. So plus the recoupment of the publisher, that usually means they don't make a lot of money on the success of the game. While here, the system is still very much geared towards both parties really banking on games becoming a hit. Kind of like you want developers to be motivated to make successful games and not just live off of the production of prototypes, also from a publisher's point of view. That is also why not always the complete burn rate of the studios is covered. Like while you want to share the risk, you don't necessarily want to take the risk completely onto the publisher's side. So everybody stays invested into the success of a project more or less equally. Talking about recruitment, publishers will almost always do that, or in most cases, they will, whatever money they paid up front, they will also kind of recoup that once the game goes live. There might be some in-between scenarios where, especially if the developer still had a significant amount of the risks, that they get some profit shares earlier. But if a publisher covers nearly all of the production costs, they will usually not pay out a profit share until they make that money back after the launch of the game. Otherwise, there are similarities to work for hire kind of structures of development. So you would generally see kind of a milestone plan with payments based on the status of the game. So one before the test, one for a game after it's successfully tested, maybe somewhere in between, and then kind of like a payment at the end of development on delivery of the final game. Of course, these periods are much shorter than they would be for other games, because we're talking about like a 2-month development cycle in many cases. For publishers, this is an easier transition, I feel, than what we've seen with more mid-core kind of companies, or specific, like even especially on the PC side and stuff like that. Because the projects are relatively short, it's easier for publishers to build these kind of this know-how around production. There's not that much that can go completely wrong, especially on the way to a prototype, which is like a 2-week process sometimes. When we're talking about delays, we're talking usually about a couple of days. So it's a bit easier for publishers to transition into this. So that's also one of the reasons why they're more open to enter these kind of like partnerships and testing relationships. So let's go and talk about the tests themselves finally, though. Kind of like how are they structured and what are we going for? So testing starts earlier and earlier and earlier these days. At the beginning, as I said, publishers usually tested full games to kind of gather the whole overview of the data on all stages of the funnel. So they wanted to see how much does it cost to get people into the game, but also how do the players behave in the game, how likely is it to make the money back. But since that, of course, requires to actually make the game, which delays the whole process, or at least makes the process longer and kind of adds a lot of production cost to it, publishers started experimenting with testing earlier and earlier throughout the stages of these games. That's why like some UA tests these days, or actually a lot of UA tests these days, are being run before the game is actually being made. And generally there are a couple of test creatives, so video ads that are made from like simple placeholders. Often the gameplay programming is not really in place. Sometimes it's faked through video editing to look like the game is there and playable, just to see how people will react to that and how many people would actually click on one of these ads when they see them online. Then the publishers don't care a lot about like what happens afterwards. They linked to a random game in their portfolio or just to the general App Store landing page. They kind of just want to see how many people see the ad, get interested, and click on it to learn more about the game. But these days, because you want to have a little bit more information, usually people are also using ASO, so store optimization tools like Splitmetrics or GeekLab to get a little bit more of the user journey without actually having to make the game. So what these kind of services allow you to do is create a fake App Store page and then track the user behavior on these pages. That was originally used a lot for A/B testing, so you can test different screenshots, titles, descriptions, icons of your game. But this way, you actually get to see if there would be an install or not, because generally, if you don't have the game yet, you don't have kind of like an install button you can link people to, and this is kind of an important steps. And of course, not only one of these tests happen. Usually they happen throughout the development of the game with kind of like gates in between. So you would start with a creative or a creative plus the store page kind of test to see how the game performs. You maybe test 5 to 10 of these and then pick the ones that perform the best and take them over into prototype development, then test that and get more information and so on. To kind of like represent the information you want to see in each of these stages. So when you only do the goal of this is to mostly find the games that are not going to work. It's very hard to predict a sure hit with these kind of games, but it's the dots, the almost certain fails, or the super high risk endeavors that you want to filter out early with these, right? So on the creative only side, the very early kind of CTR tests, as they're often referred to, that is what you're looking for, the click-through rate of individual ads. Usually you start with 3 to 5 different ads to kind of represent the game in different ways. That process is a whole different kind of like magical situation that you can look into, and there are a lot of good talks about that, how to make good creatives, how to really get people hooked and interested in the games. Can be very different between games. So you generally try stuff like having a player play really bad in the game, having somebody who plays really good at the game, showing off like a fun special moment in the game, kind of like across the board, spread that out a little bit to see how people react to it. You can try to kind of like get a rough CPI out of that, but it's not as reliable as using one of these ASO tools and actually getting how many people that come to the store page will also end up installing the game then, because that can be a little bit different also depending on which platform you use or which kind of channel you use. But I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the next couple of slides. But having the click-through rate and the conversion rate for somebody who will install the game most likely, that is where you can really start calculating your cost per install, how much you have to invest per player to get the game into people's hands. Of course, that is only one half of kind of the magic scale that is all about. You also want to know if people will actually generate enough money so you can pay these cost per installs in the beginning. And that's really only starts when you come into the prototype testing. So that is when you are looking for the retention of the game. So how many people that start playing on one day are still there the next day, 5 days down the road, 7 days down the road. And that's usually the maximum of what you can go to with a prototype. Very much depends on what you or your publishing partner means when they talk about the definition of a prototype. But generally, the first couple of days of retention is what you get out of these early prototype tests. Also, what you get is the average playtime per user. So you know how many minutes a day the user will spend to your game. And that already gives you a little bit of a guidance when it comes to calculation, how many ads the people will be able to consume in this time and how much money you're likely to be making that based on the experience that you have from other games. Of course, there's always a certain amount of mystery to that until you launched your finished game. A lot of the content, kind of how diverse the gameplay experience is, more complicated meta systems that you see more and more in hyper casual games, those really only come into place once the game is further along in development. So for a very reliable kind of calculation of the lifetime value, LTV of a user, that comes at the very end when your game is already done. So you cannot really tell at one of these earlier stages, hey, this is going to be a hit game that's going to make us a lot of money, without actually getting to the end. But as I said, it's more about identifying the games that will fail very early in this process and never get to a situation where they could actually be in the position to be successful. So you save a lot of resources and time on those games and can then reinvest that into the ones that have a higher chance of success. One point maybe that we are pretty bullish on is when it comes to the retention, there's also a certain kind of amount of players that you want to have in the game. Generally, you say anything under 100 new users per day during testing. It can work for like the marketing side of things, but for the in-game stuff, so retention, playtime, and so on, you need at least 100 users a day to kind of balance out wild fluctuations between the different users. If you're lower than that, you have like really great days with super high retention, and then you have a weird day that is super low and you don't really know why. Generally, that is because you don't have enough users in the game. There's some other kind of things that that might impact that. I'm actually talking about that on the next slide. The testing methodology. So pretty much everybody in the hyper-casual field uses Facebook for these kind of tests. It's a super common UA tool after the fact. So most of the publishers use it a lot once the game is live anyway. So it's good to get like comparable information through that. Tests are, by the way, often iOS only and US only, but it depends. You don't really have to focus as much on like technical tests. So for a mid-core game, you would, for example, advertise in Southeast Asia as well, so you can get a lot of English-speaking players pretty cheap to see if the multiplayer part holds up to that kind of traffic. Usually you don't have that in hyper-casual games. You want to have data that's as representative as your main markets as possible. So you're also targeting as widely as possible. I mean, hyper-casual games generally are games that are made to appeal to as many players as possible anyway. Very rarely have kind of like niche focused games in hyper casual. But even if you have audiences that you assume will lean more male versus female, older versus younger, for these testing purposes, it's generally best practice to kind of start out as wide as possible and then later adjust a little bit, narrow it down, and see if you can improve that numbers. But you kind of want to have comparabilities between the games. It's not always 100% possible. For us, the big example is JoyPac is a company that the majority of my colleagues are in Beijing, China. It's still one of our biggest markets. For the games that we launched globally, still 30% of our user base is in China, and we have a bunch of China exclusive titles as well. And then, of course, we run into the problem that Facebook is not available in China. So people can't really use it there. We can't advertise through it. So we have to look for a different solution to kind of test there. For us specifically, in this case, that's Mintegrill. It's a partner we've been working with in China for a long time. They're very reliable for us. It's one of our main channels afterwards when the game goes live. So a lot of the same reasons why most publishers use Facebook outside of China is also why we use, in this case, Mintegrill for China. But in general, I would say consistency is key. As I mentioned a couple of times, you don't really want to have too many variables different from test to test. You really want to focus on like keeping things the same as you can. So vastly different budgets, different targeting, holidays, or sometimes including weekends, sometimes don't. All of that kind of messes up your results and makes it harder for you to decide which games are actually very popular with players and which maybe just had the luck to be throughout the right time. I mean, there's always a timing factor to it, of course, but you want to give all of the games that you're testing equal chances to make these tests comparable. Good UA people, no matter if they're working for the developers themselves or on the publisher side, will be able to kind of tell you how much room for optimization there is. Because, of course, you could argue, okay, like a big general test, there's still a lot of stuff that you can do for each individual game. But a good UA employee would usually be able to tell you kind of like, all right, for this kind of game, we think we could get 10% more here, 20% more there, and reiterate on the tests with like quick follow-ups that are a little bit more targeted to get additional information. So of course, at the end, you're looking for results. Before I come to like some specific examples of these results, I want to say a couple more general things. So the target KPIs, the key performance indicators that publishers are looking for, can vary a lot. It varies by just them only focusing on the super top end. So if you're talking to somebody like Voodoo, for example, they of course are very selective about the kind of games that they're working on. So they're going to look for really low CPIs under the 20 cents kind of limit, while other publishers are maybe a little bit more lenient when it comes to kind of like, especially when it's unoptimized tests, right? What still could be a good model for them. It also depends on the game themselves. So an idle game or a more ultra casual game like I Peel Good, of course, the CPIs have to be way more competitive than it has to be for something like a Nachero style game, which monetizes way longer with way higher retention and also some in-app purchases. So it really depends a bit on the project as well. What are kind of like the things you're focusing on and what you're looking for. That said, the earlier you go into testing and like more shifting towards these super early tests makes it more likely that there are strict hard KPI benchmarks, like a hard target you have to reach, because you don't have more additional information. For a game that is completely done and you can test all of it, you can look into retention and these kind of things, you can build this holistic business case of saying like, okay, this game might not be as strong in marketing as some of the other titles we tested are, but it has super high retention, people are going to stick around, there's very high engagement, so rewarded ads are used more frequently and so on. So you can kind of look at the whole business case a bit better. While if you only have the CTR test to pull your numbers from, that is kind of what you have to rely on, right? And then you have to make a decision based on that. Good publishers, again, have kind of like expectations for specific games, so they know that a game that is a bit more ambitious when it comes to the scope of the game, kind of like the long-term features, metagame, and so on, maybe in their purchases, that they adjust their expectation for these early tests appropriately. But yeah, it's more likely that a game gets shut down at that point based on one number alone. So, and from talking to a couple different publishers, from our own experience, from developers we work with, I tried to put together a couple of numbers that are frequent throughout the industry. So the test budgets, this is not necessarily a number that everybody does, but I just wanted to show that you can be pretty conservative when it comes to the budgets of these tests. So a $50 budget per day generally gives you information that is quality enough to kind of then get the right conclusions through that. The one caveat maybe is that if you have a prototype already and retention is something that is important to you, of course, you want these 100+ installs, better 150 installs to kind of have these numbers reliable. So you already have to have a pretty good CPI in the beginning to get to these numbers on that budget. So if that's something you really care about, you might want to bump that up a little bit, especially for more complex games. So you actually get the data that you want. But it's still not a problem to start out with these lower numbers and then kind of adjust once you see what CPRs are actually like. On the click-through rate, so the amount of people that see the ad and then will actually click on it, generally what we hear, 2.5% is considered pretty good. If you have over 5%, that is great. That's really a game that you want to focus on, one that you're definitely going to take to a prototype stage if you haven't planned that already. Is really a good amount to kind of follow up on that. And then once they come to the store page, you want most of these players then to convert and actually install the game. And by that, I mean the vast majority, 70%, 80%, definitely more than half of the people that end up on your store page should install the game. That is not always super reliable, depending on kind of your channel partner and so on. That's why we like to look at the IVR as well. IVR is the relationship between people that see an ad and then people end up installing the game. So kind of like combining CTR and CVR into one number, because that filters out a bunch of kind of like weird factors, like these ads that almost facilitate accidental clicks, these ads where it's almost impossible to kind of close them without clicking them and actually being forwarded to the store, or just being automatically forwarded to the store at the end of the ad. And of course, that kind of changes your click-through rate. Suddenly you have like 50% click-through rate, and then none of these players actually end up installing the game. And by combining these numbers, you can filter that out a little bit. As I said, it's not super important once you have your one partner that you know is reliable. If you do it only with Facebook, you can kind of rely on that. But in general, it's a good practice to filter out a couple of things that could have maybe gone wrong. Also, maybe you have an ad that completely misrepresents the game that you're trying to sell, and people are kind of like bummed out by how the store page is looking. So that kind of like covers that as well. And for us, for video specifically, so it's of course different for playable ads or for statics, it's 2%. So 2% of people that watch the ad end up installing it is a pretty good number. And sometimes we have 3, 4, in one case we even had 5. And that is really good for us in an early test. That is kind of like a clear sign for us to take it further. CPIs I already mentioned. A lot of publishers are looking for like under 20, 25 cents on that, super competitive, getting harder and harder to achieve these, especially with with hyper casual games that have a little bit more content, that are not trying to appeal to kind of like a to like a like a very wide simple audience, very little challenge in the games and so on. So we are usually happy with tests where CPIs are under 50 cents, specifically also because we know these can be improved with further optimization. Once you have an actual prototype that you're testing, as I said, retention becomes the next big thing. For very early prototype, I would say 30 to 35% is already a pretty good indicator. If you only have a couple levels that keep looping and you know that people will kind of see everything the game has to offer within the first like 10, 15, 20 minutes of playing your game, it doesn't necessarily mean that that those numbers will represent the full game. So 30, 35% already pretty good. If it's a bit more advanced, if you can kind of like have the assumptions that this will be very similar to people that will download the final game, 40% is kind of like the magical number you hear from a lot of people of like, yeah, what you're looking for. Day 7 is a bit more tricky, right? You can test that way later in the process, and it has a huge impact on the lifetime value. So small increases on that number have a huge impact on the success of the game. Generally 10 to 12%, something that you're hearing there a lot. And again, that's something that is hard to test, but it kind of also pushes home the fact of how many of your players you're going to lose. So 90% of hyper casual players nearly will have left the game after a week, which is also why we see more and more kind of like meta system crawling into the game. And then last but not least, as I mentioned, the playtime really helps you to calculate kind of like how many ads you can show. Generally, we don't show a lot of ads in these prototype tests. Often we don't have it implemented because that will have impacts on retention and playtime, and you really want to be careful in the way you implement that and kind of A/B test a lot of stuff. So just to keep that out of the equation, we don't integrate any monetization into early prototypes. But based on the amount of time that people are spending in the game combined with the retention numbers, we can calculate out like how many ads we can probably show people without affecting those numbers too much, and then how much revenue that would mean per user. And for playtime, we are happy with about 18 to 21 minutes. So 3 sessions at 6 to 7 minutes is really good. And under it kind of like, yeah, depends again of the game, of course, but then it becomes more competitive with the CPIs as well. And yeah, that is basically it when it comes to content of the talk. This means, of course, like all this testing should lead you to successful releases. This is actually a bit older slides, so I have to update that. We have launched way more than 35 games, and we're getting close to the $100 million downloads. We kind of missed it, having $100 million downloads in 2 years of the company existing. We just had our second birthday. We had a couple hits specifically in China with games in the top 50 and even top 5, and we're expanding massively into like other markets. More and more stuff that we're producing these days is global. Also, one of the reasons why we went into this early testing is kind of we want to work with developers more to kind of understand the global market, get into it, and kind of use the stuff we learned for China specifically to push games there. So yeah, if you want to talk about any of this, if you have games that you're looking for a publisher for, if you're looking for somebody that can help you in China specifically, feel free to reach out to me. My email's on the screen, or otherwise I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. And that's it for me. Thank you very much for your attention. Of course, if we have any questions right now, I'd be happy to answer those. But also, like, yeah, just reach out to me if you see this later and have any questions at another time. I'm more than happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you, Falco. I actually have one question. In the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned the user acquisition. And I just wanted to ask if there are like some basic elements to conduct a successful UA campaign, except Facebook tools. Maybe there are some other stuff.
So yeah, there are a couple of things that you can do. A lot of is just like looking at what your competitors are doing. So there are some things that help with that. For example, you There is Facebook itself has kind of like a tool where you can look at creatives that are being used. App Annie has some intelligence on that these days if you can afford to get all the data from them. They have like really good and reliable data. But then yeah, just look what other people are doing. There are always trends. Just like in midcore, you can see trends of like influencers being used and so on. We see trends like using real videos, just like being super creative about that, trying new things, but also keeping kind of like an eye on what is popular right now, what is working, and not just like being left behind by like testing only old styles. But as I said, it's you usually should kind of have a wider test for the kind of creatives you are doing. That's not only for video, that's also for playables, for example. For some games, a playable ad can perform really well if it's really easy to win kind of like a quick level of the game, because it just feels nice and people want to repeat that feeling. But for some games, especially on the puzzlier side, sometimes you want to have it very difficult and have the player actually fail during the playable ad, so they get this feeling of, oh, I was so close, I want to beat that, I'm going to download this game, and then I can actually do it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. As far as I see, no one else has written any questions. Yeah, and I think that's it for today.
Cool. All right.
Yeah, okay. So thank you so much once again.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah,
Anytime.
okay. Thanks everyone for joining us. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, goodbye. Have a nice day.
Great. Thanks everyone. Have a good evening. Stay
Yeah.
healthy.
You too. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.